But we gradually came to understand that we really wanted to mount an attack on physicalism, and that it would need to have two stages. The first would be an mainly empirical stage in which we would try to assemble in one place a lot of evidence which appears to undermine the physicalist worldview. And then the second stage, much harder, would be to try to imagine what sort of alternative worldview could overcome the limitations that we discovered in stage one. So we began to compose our own list of topics that are difficult for physicalism, and we based our effort actually on a book that had been published in 1903 by a man named F.W.H. Myers, who was one of the founders of the British Society for Psychical Research. Myers had done essentially the same thing in terms of the information available to him, and he, in his book, it's a 2-volume, 1,400-page effort, collected a variety of kinds of evidence that to him proved the falsehood of materialism. So we revisited a number of his topics and some other things in the light of the subsequent century plus of refereed biomedical research. Anyway, I'm going to describe just a few of the high points of Irreducible Mind, which is itself an 800-page book. I was going to wave a copy in front of you, but my mother-in-law appears to have given it to somebody else in the family. First on any such list, and apologies now to John and Jeff, is the phenomena studied in psychical research, including extrasensory perception, PK, psychokinesis, and even evidence of survival. And I'm in the book, we didn't want our book to be a parapsychology book, so we instead sort of absorbed the entire body of literature by reference and provided only a annotated bibliography, which, John, I recommend to you in particular. It's a little out of date now, but reliable pointers into the non-tawdry parts of the subject. And I'll say only that from my point of view, anyone who becomes reasonably familiar with the hundreds of thousands of pages of case studies, case and field studies, and the thousands of experimental studies published in refereed journals cannot fail to come away feeling that there is something here that science is going to have to come to grips with sooner or later. I won't attempt to defend that proposition, but I hold it very strongly. Now, many scientists, of course, this is the reason why psychical research is so objectionable to so many people. They see the conflict between the things that are described in that literature and expectations deriving from the conventional physicalist point of view. And the hope is that this is the one sort of anomaly you can kind of isolate and quarantine it. And meanwhile, physicalism can proceed triumphantly on all other subjects. Well, that is not the case, however. In addition to the things that I mentioned earlier, there are a number of well-established psychophysiological phenomena, psychophysical phenomena, that point in the same direction. I'll give just a couple of examples. My wife has a great chapter on extreme psychophysical influence. And she starts with sort of generic stuff like many placebo effects and so on, works her way gradually to things that are more and more specific and harder to explain in conventional physiological terms. For example, things like hypnotic blisters, taking the form of a 5-pointed star at the end of a poker that the hypnotist has said is red hot, but which is in fact cool, touches the patient's skin. A blister arises with that geometric shape. Now, we know how a hot poker can produce a correspondingly shaped blister, but not how you can produce it from the inside out, so to speak. There are lots of other things of that sort, cases of persons recalling a traumatic episode in which He had been tied to a bed with a rope as a young child. As he remembers this episode, welts appear on his wrists that were photographed and published in the article describing this, looking very much like rope burns or rope shape. There are things like hypnotic analgesia. Esdale in India, before there was general anesthesia, talks about operations, for example, one in which I inserted the knife at the corner of his mouth, drew it to his ear, then across to the eye, peeled back the tissue, squeezed out the tumor. The patient moaned slightly. And he did well over 1,000 operations of this sort with nothing but hypnosis. T.X. Barber, an opponent of the idea that there's anything really unusual in hypnosis, attempted to explain this away as by the fact that, well, the patient wanted to please his surgeon, so he suppressed his pain. Anyway, so there are lots of those kinds of things, and sometimes they even involve influences between one person and another person's body. For example, particularly in the 19th century, a lot of cases were published of what are called maternal impressions, in which a pregnant woman sees some ghastly situation, an accident or something, and particularly when this occurs in the first trimester, a child is then born with a corresponding birth defect. And it was thought at the time, this is kind of interesting from a history of science point of view, that the mother and the child were sort of two separate beings, or were one being. And as it became clear that they are not, and that this is very hard to explain, the number of cases declined, although there are still some in the 20th century. A second category of things that we have a chapter on in the book is psychological automatisms and secondary centers of consciousness. This has a lot to do with what's become known in the 20th century as multiple personality disorder, or more recently, dissociative identity disorder. And the really interesting part of the subject is cases in which an everyday personality A is shown to coexist in the same body with a secondary personality B, and there can be more of these. And there are interesting relationships between the two, in that A may be only dimly aware or not at all aware of B's existence, and yet B knows a great deal about what's going on in A. So there's a kind of asymmetry in the consciousness of the two entities. Both of which seem like ordinary minds or personalities to an external observer. The alters or dissociated personalities can also sometimes differ in startling ways, like they may require different eyeglass prescriptions or have different patterns of allergies. And this is, again, stuff well documented in recent biomedical literature. One of the reasons why this stuff is important is that it provides an empirically confirmed example of exactly the sort of thing that Bernardo's theory calls for on a more cosmic scale. That is, Bernardo's version of analytic idealism holds that there is one consciousness, which is the ground of everything, and that it dissociates to produce us and our experience of a surrounding world. And the splitting of consciousness into multiple personalities is a well-documented phenomenon. Incidentally, this was a major preoccupation of Myers's. A recent book, or not so recent, but fairly recent book by Steve Browdy, a philosopher, on multiple personality. It's called First Person Plural, and Browdy arrives at pretty much the same picture that Myers created of how we should think about this disorder.